A Ukrainian soldier near the Russian border pulled a section of a downed missile from a scorched field outside Kharkiv. The serial numbers on the fragment did not match anything in Russia's known arsenal. When investigators traced the parts, they led not to a Russian factory, but to North Korea. It was a small discovery, one missile among thousands, but it opened a question that American defense officials had been avoiding for years. What if the world's most watched rivalries were no longer separate stories? What if Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, and Tehran had quietly stopped acting alone? The instinct to keep watching for a single dramatic reveal misses what is actually happening here. There is no secret summit, no signed pact hidden from public view. The evidence is scattered across customs records, satellite imagery, casualty estimates, and cyber forensics, each piece unremarkable on its own. The real discovery lies in what happens when analysts finally lay all of those pieces side by side. For most of the last 3 decades, Washington treated these 4 governments as 4 unconnected problems, each with its own desk, its own analysts, its own strategy. Russia was a European and nuclear concern, a rivalry inherited from the Cold War and reshaped by the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. China was an economic and Pacific concern, a relationship that shifted from trade partnership to strategic competition over the course of 2 decades, as Beijing built the world's largest navy and asserted control over the South China Sea. North Korea was a proliferation concern, isolated since the armistice that ended the Korean War in 1953 and sanctioned repeatedly over its nuclear weapons program. Iran was a Middle Eastern and terrorism concern, a hostility dating back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the hostage crisis that followed. Each relationship was serious, but each was contained in its own file, managed by different regional bureaus, different sanctions regimes, and different sets of assumptions about what the other 3 countries were doing. That framework is now being tested by a stream of verified events over the past 2 years, showing these 4 countries trading weapons, technology, intelligence, and in one case, soldiers, across each other's wars. The clearest and most literal evidence sits in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian and South Korean intelligence assessments, North Korea sent an estimated 11,000 to 15,000 troops into Russia's Kursk region beginning in late 2024 to help repel a Ukrainian incursion. The first time Pyongyang had committed forces to a foreign war since the Korean War itself. South Korea's National Intelligence Service has estimated that North Korea suffered roughly 6,000 casualties, killed or wounded in that campaign, a staggering toll for a force many analysts had assumed existed only for defense of the peninsula. In April 2025, both governments publicly confirmed what had been reported for months, that North Korean soldiers had fought and died on Russian soil. Kim Jong-un's government called them heroes. Russian President Vladimir Putin thanked Pyongyang directly, and the 2 countries pointed to a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement signed in mid-2024 by Moscow that includes a mutual defense clause as the legal basis for the deployment. In exchange, South Korea's Institute for Defense Analyses has documented a surge in North Korean arms exports to Russia, rising from roughly 20,000 shipping containers of munitions between 2023 and early 2025 to an estimated 33,000 containers by March 2026, filled with artillery shells, rocket systems, anti-tank weapons, and short-range ballistic missiles. Reporting from Reuters in early August 2026 describes a North Korean missile unit, roughly 90 personnel equipped with up to 120 ballistic missiles and 6 launchers, now deploying into Russia's Voronezh region near the Ukrainian border. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said Russia is preparing facilities there to receive as many as 30,000 additional North Korean troops, though Reuters has noted it could not independently verify that specific figure. What North Korea gains from this arrangement is not simply money, though the revenue is real and, by some estimates, has reached $20 billion since 2023. Defense analysts point to something more consequential: battlefield experience. Soldiers who fought in Kursk are reportedly being rotated home to serve as instructors, passing along lessons in drone warfare, artillery coordination, and modern combined arms tactics that North Korea has never had the opportunity to practice at scale in its 70-year history as an isolated state. In return, Russia is believed to be transferring technology for North Korean missiles, satellites, and submarines, upgrades that South Korean and Western intelligence agencies have flagged as a direct threat to the security balance on the Korean peninsula. A relationship that began as a wartime convenience has become, in the assessment of multiple governments, a channel through which North Korea is quietly modernizing its military for the first time in a generation, with consequences that extend far beyond the war in Ukraine and reach directly into the defense calculations of South Korea, Japan, and the roughly 28,000 American troops still stationed on the peninsula. While that exchange unfolded in Europe, a separate and far more direct confrontation was building in the Middle East, one rooted in years of failed diplomacy. Negotiations over a new agreement to limit Iran's nuclear program collapsed in February 2026, after Omani mediators reported that Iran had signaled a willingness to make concessions. But President Trump said publicly that he was not satisfied with the pace of talks. Days later, on February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated campaign against Iran, striking nearly 900 targets within the first 12 hours, according to Britannica's account of the war. The opening strikes killed Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of officials, and also killed an estimated 170 people when a missile hit a girls' school near a naval base in Manab. President Trump stated the campaign's goals were to destroy Iran's ballistic missile capability, neutralize its navy, prevent it from ever building a nuclear weapon, and cut off its support for regional proxy forces. And he called publicly for regime change. Iran responded with retaliatory missile and drone strikes on American and Israeli targets across the region, including a strike on a United States Navy facility in Bahrain, and moved to disrupt shipping near the Strait of Hormuz, unsettling global oil markets and halting air travel across much of the Middle East. By the time a ceasefire took hold on April 8th, after roughly 40 days of sustained combat, Iranian human rights monitors estimated the war had killed at least 657 people inside Iran and wounded over 2,000, while Iran's health ministry put the wounded figure above 2,500. The conflict, sometimes referred to in its opening phase as the 12-day war, remains formally unresolved, with a fragile Pakistan-mediated ceasefire and unresolved disputes over Iran's nuclear ambitions, control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the lifting of sanctions. This is not the first time these four countries, or their predecessor governments, have coordinated during a war against American forces. During the Korean War, the Soviet Union supplied pilots and aircraft to North Korea, while newly communist China sent hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River, a three-way arrangement that caught American planners off guard and helped fight the conflict to a stalemate. What is different today is the scope. The current cooperation spans 4 countries instead of 2, touches conflicts on 3 separate continents, and moves not only weapons and manpower but cyber access, satellite technology, and industrial know-how, categories of leverage that did not exist in anything like their current form 70 years ago. It was during this war that the pattern connecting all 4 countries became difficult to ignore. Open reporting, corroborated across multiple outlets tracking the conflict, indicates that China maintained its long-standing economic and military relationship with Iran throughout the fighting, with Chinese companies supplying dual-use technology, including missile components and geospatial intelligence, even as Beijing publicly postured as a mediator and evacuated its own citizens from Iranian territory. China abstained from United Nations votes condemning Iran, aligning procedurally with Russia. Russian officials, meanwhile, reportedly provided intelligence support that helped Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps identify potential targets tied to American forces in the region, according to reporting cited by the Washington Times, a continuation of a relationship built years earlier when Iran began supplying Russia with Shahed-type attack drones and the production knowledge to manufacture them domestically, technology that Russia has used extensively against Ukrainian cities since 2022. None of these 3 governments entered the Iran war as a combatant. None fired a shot at American or Israeli forces, but each moved to shore up Iran's position, materially or diplomatically, while Washington and its allies were fully engaged on a separate, unrelated front in Ukraine. This is the moment analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies point to in a book published in 2026 titled Axis of Aggressors, which argues that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea now function as a loosely aligned bloc capable of forcing the United States to confront multiple crises at once, even without anything resembling a NATO-style treaty. Co-author Elaine Dezensky describes their relationship not as an ideological alliance, but as what she calls a fractured alignment, held together by mutual necessity rather than trust. In her account, the logic is transactional and almost mechanical. China needs energy and buys discounted oil from both Russia and Iran while selling them manufactured goods and market access. Russia and Iran need buyers willing to ignore Western sanctions. North Korea needs any lifeline it can find, whether in cash, food, fuel, or military technology. None of the 4 in this reading particularly trusts the others, and China in particular has historically kept its distance from open military entanglement, preferring to let Russia, Iran, and North Korea absorb the diplomatic cost of confrontation with the United States, while Beijing quietly benefits from the resulting discounts on energy and the strain placed on American resources and attention. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, another contributor to the same research, has warned that the deeper danger is not any single country's strength, but the level of coordination between them, and he has argued that a crisis over Taiwan could see North Korea threaten South Korea, or stage limited provocations specifically to pin down American forces, while a confrontation between Russia and NATO's Baltic members could be accompanied by Iranian-linked disruption elsewhere, stretching the United States across 3 or 4 fronts simultaneously, a scenario the Pentagon has historically not been sized or funded to handle at once. Yet, this framework is far from universally accepted, and the disagreement matters as much as the evidence itself. Reporting from Time in early August 2026 notes that after the Iran war exposed this web of cooperation, some U.S. intelligence assessments swung in the opposite direction, with a 2026 edition of a key intelligence community publication concluding that the idea of coordinated adversary alignment overstates how much genuine cooperation is currently taking place. In other words, the same government that watched North Korean troops die in Kursk, watched Chinese components reach Iranian missile systems, and watched Russia court Pyongyang for tens of thousands of additional soldiers, has also produced an internal assessment cautioning analysts against assuming these 4 countries are executing a shared strategy. That contradiction is not a minor footnote in an obscure report. It reflects a genuine, unresolved debate among people with access to the same classified evidence about whether what looks like coordination is actually opportunism, 4 authoritarian governments independently taking advantage of American overstretch rather than deliberately orchestrating it together, and whether treating them as a single bloc might cause Washington to overreact to what is, in reality, 4 separate governments pursuing 4 separate sets of self-interest that happen to overlap. While that debate plays out in Washington, a quieter and less visible front has been developing for years inside the digital infrastructure that keeps American life running. Cybersecurity researchers first identified a Chinese state-linked hacking group tracked under the name Volt Typhoon, embedded inside United States power grids, water utilities, and transportation networks as early as 2021, though it was not publicly exposed until 2023, when the FBI learned the group had lived undetected inside a small Massachusetts utility systems for nearly 10 months. Unlike traditional espionage operations that steal data and leave, investigators from the National Security Agency, the FBI, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency concluded that Volt Typhoon's purpose was different, pre-positioning access inside civilian infrastructure that could be triggered during a future military conflict, specifically one involving Taiwan, to slow American mobilization by disrupting the power, water, or transportation systems that ports and military bases depend on. In March 2024, a joint investigation by the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance confirmed the group's ties to the Chinese state. And later that year, Chinese officials, in an indirect and closely guarded exchange described by the Wall Street Journal, acknowledged for the first time that the campaign was connected to American support for Taiwan. As of 2026, cybersecurity researchers report that Volt Typhoon and related Chinese hacking groups, including Salt Typhoon and APT-41, remain active inside American infrastructure, alongside a parallel campaign of rapidly escalating cyber attacks against Taiwan's own hospitals, power grid, and telecommunications networks, an approach researchers describe as preparation for economic and infrastructure coercion that could force a Taiwanese capitulation without a conventional invasion at all. Taken individually, each of these developments has a defensible, narrow explanation. North Korea needed money and modern weapons. Russia needed manpower after years of grinding losses in Ukraine. China needed continued access to discounted energy and wanted leverage over Taiwan's future. Iran needed partners willing to defy sanctions after decades of isolation. But NATO's own assessment, cited in Reuters reporting from August 2026, states plainly that Russia's growing military and economic ties with North Korea, China, and Iran now constitute a threat that extends beyond Europe, reaching into the Indo-Pacific and North America as well. That is a striking claim from an alliance built specifically around a single adversary during the Cold War, now acknowledging that the boundaries between regional threats have become difficult to draw, and that a missile fired in Ukraine, a drone flown over Israel, and a line of malicious code sitting inside an American water treatment plant may ultimately trace back to the same interconnected web of suppliers and beneficiaries. What remains genuinely unknown is where the line sits between coordination and coincidence. There is no public evidence of a joint command structure, no single treaty binding all 4 nations to defend one another, and the book, Axis of Aggressors itself, acknowledges as much, describing an arrangement without unified planning or complete trust among its members. Chinese and Russian reactions to the opening days of the Iran war were, by most independent accounts, notably restrained rather than escalatory, suggesting neither country was eager to be pulled into direct confrontation with the United States on Iran's behalf. Whether the war in Ukraine, the aftermath of the Iran war, and the standoff over Taiwan are converging into a single strategic contest, or whether they simply share opportunistic overlap driven by 4 governments each pursuing separate self-interest, is a question serious analysts on both sides continue to argue without a settled answer, and it is a question with real consequences. because how Washington answers it will shape how much money, attention, and military capacity gets directed toward each front in the years ahead. What is not in dispute is the practical effect on American military planning. The Pentagon has spent decades building forces sized and postured for one major regional conflict at a time, with enough surge capacity to also deter a second. The current pattern: an active if uneasy ceasefire with Iran that has already been tested by strikes on both sides since April, a grinding war in Ukraine now drawing in North Korean soldiers and missile units, persistent Chinese cyber prepositioning tied to a possible Taiwan contingency, and NATO's own warning about the reach of this cooperation describes something closer to 4 simultaneous pressure points than one contained crisis. Whether or not the 4 governments are coordinating a shared plan, the cumulative strain on American attention, resources, and alliances is the same either way, and that is the part defense planners say cannot wait for the intelligence community to reach a final verdict on intent. For ordinary Americans, the consequences are less abstract than they might first appear. Higher costs for defense budgets already stretched across multiple regions, greater exposure for the power grids and water systems that Volt Typhoon has spent years quietly mapping, and a foreign policy landscape where a crisis in one region can no longer be assumed to stay contained there. The story of these 4 countries is still being written in real time through troop rotations in Kursk, missile parts recovered from Ukrainian fields, cyber intrusions quietly sitting inside American infrastructure, and a fragile ceasefire in the Middle East that remains only months old. What began as 4 separate rivalries, each contained in its own file, now moves as something closer to a single interconnected pressure on American power, whether by design or by accident of shared interest. The evidence does not yet answer which of those 2 explanations is true, and the people with the deepest access to classified intelligence remain divided on the question themselves. But it does answer a simpler question, the one that mattered most when that first unidentified missile fragment was pulled from a field outside Kharkiv. These 4 countries are no longer acting as though the others' wars are none of their business, and neither, increasingly, can the United States. The debate over intent, whether Beijing, Moscow, Pyongyang, and Tehran are executing a plan or simply exploiting a moment, may ultimately matter less than the outcome either path produces. A superpower forced, for the first time since the Cold War, to plan for the possibility that its next crisis will not arrive alone.